I thought, if you haven't been here, go online, click on vbs.org, click on the, you can click on the archive for all of these sessions. All the sessions are archived. And you can listen to them, and they've been wonderful, wonderful conversations with very sensitive and poetic scholars. You want to add something? Yeah. 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 Some of them we had trouble with at the beginning of the year, but if you go through the year, you'll see that they get better. So don't give up, okay? I know, I want to say we said thank you for the light. So before we begin, I want to say thank you to a few people, because this is the end of our semester tonight, and I want to say thank you. So first of all, to our volunteers extraordinaire, to Louise Spitzer and to Bill Kabacher, for your service and care and taking care of all of us. Thank you so very much. To Alana Zimmerman, who's the program director. Thank you to Alana. To Jess and Lil Stein, who've endowed this program and made it possible. And to everyone who's been coming to study with us and to be with us. Sometimes, like tonight, the weather's been awful and the traffic's been worse, and you still came out to learn with us. So we're very grateful to everyone who's come to learn with us and to be with us during the course of this series. And if you haven't seen them all, they're really very excellent conversations with a wide variety of scholars and rabbis and teachers of all kinds. And it's a wonderful education in personal theology. So thank you all for being with us. A couple of quick announcements of things going on in the community. Friday night, we're going to have a Tamarim service. That's our Sephardic musical service. It begins at 6:30. If you come a little early, there's a nosh. A nosh is an old Sephardic word meaning something to eat before the service. And the service is a beautiful service put on by Asher Levy, who's our artist in residence. Starts at 6:30. It's a beautiful opportunity to hear Sephardic music. Shabbos mornings, of course, we always have Torah study at 9 o'clock. On next Wednesday night, if you're not busy and you've been coming Wednesday nights, come again, because next Wednesday night at 7:30, we're going to welcome the leaders of an organization called Israel Aid. Israel Aid is the part of Israel that sends out help when communities around the world have disasters, particularly natural disasters. So when there's a flood in Indonesia or an earthquake in Haiti, and you hear about the Israelis who come with a field hospital or with rescue workers, it's Israel Aid that does that work. And they're coming next week, and we'll be talking to them about their efforts and celebrating with them. And that's really worthwhile. And then 3 Shabbatot that I want you to know about. 4, actually. Saturday morning, the 2nd of March, which is not this Shabbos, but a week from Shabbos, Shabbos morning, about 11:30 in the morning, and then after lunch during our shiur, our guest is going to be Professor Ken Stein. Professor Stein teaches political science and history at Emory University, and he's the chairman of the Israel Studies Department at Emory. Ken is an expert on American foreign policy in the Middle East and has been worked for government in a number of different administrations, and now is in academics, and he's going to be talking to us about American foreign policy in a rapidly changing Middle East. So he'll speak from the Bima at 11:30. Then we'll go get lunch, and after lunch we'll have a conversation with him. It's free and it's open to everybody in the community. The following Tuesday, which is Tuesday the 5th, we'll have Jonathan Greenblatt, who's the head of ADL, the national head of the Anti-Defamation League, will be here to discuss with us the rise of anti-Semitism in America and abroad. And then on that Shabbos, on the 9th, we're going to have Elise Berkeley, who is the local chairman of Jewish National Fund, talk to us about their efforts in Israel. And the following Shabbos morning, you taking all this down? There's a quiz. The following Shabbos morning, which is the 16th, Adam Milstein, who is a philanthropist, he's the head of the IAC, the Israel American Council, will be here to talk to us about anti-Semitism in America and what we can do about it. So please come and join us for all of those programs. Lots of opportunities to enjoy learning together. And then next month in April, not only will we'll have Passover, but we'll have the opening of the new building. It's slated to open, yes, the new building, slated to open in late April, and we'll have a dedication together. And we'll all go and play some basketball together, okay? We have concerts, we have theater, we have basketball, some wonderful things. Good? So tonight we have a wonderful scholar, a dear friend of mine. I want to introduce him in a moment, but first we got to introduce each other. So everybody stand up. It's for the last time. VBS College of Jewish Studies welcomes you. Turn to the people beside you and say, hi, I'm glad you're here. Good. And now, before you sit down, I know you want to sit down, but you'll be sitting a long time. So put your arms around your new friends and draw them close. If you're not next to somebody, move over next to somebody warm, a nice warm Jew from Tarzana. And join us in a prayer of thanksgiving for the opportunity to learn together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. I grew up in Southern California. I grew up not far from here in Canoga Park. And when I was a kid, Jewish life ended when you passed the airport. If you were driving south, no Jews lived south of the airport until you got to San Diego. There was nothing Jewish in Orange County. Mickey Mouse, yes, but nothing Jewish. Jews didn't live in Orange County. Orange County wasn't a friendly place for Jews. I went away for 20 years. I went to college. I went to school, the rabbinical school. I worked in Texas and a number of other places. And when I got back, I discovered that there's Jewish life in Orange County. And I came back, and I was invited to a little teeny synagogue in a little teeny town called Tustin, which to this day I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere in Orange County. And the synagogue met in a warehouse space. And I came to this place, and what was extraordinary about your shul was that there was a bima with an ark and a pole right here. Like I said, oh, great, there's a pole in the middle of the synagogue. What does that mean? I mean, that has to mean something. Maybe it's a connection between heaven and earth. But there was this, what? Poland, right. We were Polish Jews, right. Pole dancing? I was so trying to avoid that reference. I was so trying to keep that out of my head. In any case, what I discovered in that little synagogue in a place called Tustin, the synagogue's called B'nai Israel, is a very, very warm, loving, accepting congregation of intelligent, spiritually alive Jews. And they were led by this wonderful rabbi, Rabbi Elie Spitz. Rabbi Spitz has been the rabbi of B'nai Israel for 31 years. 31 years. You get paroled after 35, so hang in there. For 31 years, it's a warm and wonderful community. Since then, they've moved out of that warehouse space into a real shul, and it's become a real powerhouse, a real wonderful center of Jewish life. Rabbi Spitz, in addition to being a wonderful teacher and pastor and leader of a Jewish community, has published a number of very important books, including books on things that most of us don't write about. He wrote a beautiful book about the afterlife, which he'll tell us about, and a beautiful book about fighting depression and finding faith in moments of depression, and many, many beautiful reflections about Torah. So I look for somebody to end our conversation. We've had such wonderful conversations about theology, and I wondered if Ellie would be the right person. I think he's exactly the right person to come and to talk to us about what difference it makes to believe, how it changes a person's life, how it shapes a person's sensibility. So please welcome a very, very dear friend, Rabbi Elie Spitz.
Thank you. I have looked forward to coming here for quite a while, both to see my friend Rabbi Eddie and to see Alana. I have other folks like Serene and Mark Lazar. So it's a great privilege for me to have an evening here. Now that Rabbi Eddie left, I can tell you that of all my peers, if there is a colleague to whom I look to tell both a good story and to do it with flair and to do it with insight, he's my, you didn't leave. All right. It's Rabbi Elie. He's the man that I look to as both friend but also as mentor. So I'm really delighted to share tonight with you. And in talking with Rabbi Feinstein before to get oriented, I understand that tonight is the last night of a series of presentations on God. And I have a distinctive way that I teach God, and I will do that in a moment. But I thought, both to get oriented from you, I wanted to just field 5 questions that I hope to address in the time I'm with you between now and 8 before our conversation. What do you want to know about God that you've been wondering, or that you would want to ask God if you were, you've been wondering? So let me harvest 5 questions just to kind of get me oriented, and then I'll start to roll. So raise your hand, a question about God that hasn't been answered for you in the series of questions. Tell me your name. Okay, Chana Liora. What? Okay. Mm-hmm. Great. I'll come back to that in terms of, at least within monotheism and within mysticism, Jewish mysticism, female attributes of God. So what else might you want to ask? Yes, tell me your name. Okay, Mark.
So we have the biblical God.
Yes.
Which is an anthropomorphic, someone you can talk to. He has a nose, he can smell. He likes the sacrifices. He likes the odor, and he's able to have conversations with people, with Moses, and they get to know one another. So now that's from the Tanakh, from the Bible. Up to the present, though, has it transformed? Because now we're modern people. What is God to us today?
Good question. Good. So what is the difference between the biblical God and a modern perspective and gender and God? Tell me your name.
My name is Jerry Siegel, and I'm a member here for over 30 years. How do you get a teenager to believe in a God when she lost her father when she was 15 and her brother when she was 17?
Wow. That's good. Couple more? Got one here, one there, and then I'll start to roll a bit.
What is God?
Okay. Ma.
Daniel Sklar, Judaism.
What was your first name? Dove. And tell me your name?
Daniel Sklar.
Okay, Daniel.
Yes, and it's a big question. Judaism's view on afterlife.
Okay.
Mentioned that you're expert in this, and everybody interested in this. What happened?
And I'll add, Daniel, I mentioned to Rabbi Feinstein that I wanted to touch on it only in terms of, if you believe in the afterlife, or why you would believe in an afterlife, would mean that you can believe in things that are not physical. And God is not physical, ultimately, in terms of what is God. So let me start with that as a harvest to get me focused. I hope in the course of our time to address each of those. I was yesterday in St. Louis. Your congregant, our friend, Professor Ron Wolfson, was hosting a conference on relational Judaism. And I was there yesterday. And I ran into a young woman whose parents were dear friends of mine in rabbinical school. She's a singer, Ileana Light. And she writes God as G exclamation D. So I said to Ileana, I said, why exclamation in the middle of the word God? She says, because I want to blow up the word. She says, that's my, like my stick of dynamite. Because people use God in so many ways and often use God in ways to dismiss it. And she said, as a song leader in the Jewish community, she's a woman in her 20s, I want to invite young people to have holy experiences and to experience God, but without necessarily labeling God, because it's such a troubling word. It's troubling because we use metaphors to describe God, but all too often the metaphor becomes the final word. So I'm going to start with the hardest question that I was asked for me, and that's what would I say to a teenager who believed in God, who's lost her father at the age of 7 and her brother at the age of 17. I had such a situation more than once, but the time that it was most personal, okay. So the key question, that's the hardest question. The hardest question is, where is God in the midst of tragedy? So I'm going to respond to that, but here's where I'm going. I'm going to make a distinction between theology and religious experience. Martin Buber wrote a letter to Carl Jung, the great psychologist, and he said to him, there's a distinction between an experience of God, an I-thou experience of encounter, which is very different than therapy. Therapy is after the fact how you understand the relationship. And in a moment, I'm going to start with theology. Theology, again, is the arm's length. How do you understand a relationship, which is very different than the experience of relationship itself. And so when we talk about God, there is a place to use our minds to analyze as a check on wishful thinking, on false thinking, which can be dangerous, and letting ourselves go to experience God. But first, let me start with the hard question. I had a cousin who I'm very close to in Boston, whose wife went out of town. He's a sophisticated man, a lawyer, belonged to the Harvard Medical Group, and his son, at the time 9 years old, developed in the month of December very bad chills. So he called his medical group, and the nurse on the phone said, "It sounds to me like the flu. If tomorrow he's not feeling better, bring him in. But meanwhile, keep him hydrated." And so he went to the refrigerator, and he took out another Coca-Cola and did not awake that night because he had undiagnosed diabetes. He went into shock and he died. And in fact, I just wrote today, his mother just posted today, because a picture relating to her son. It's many years already, which is to say it's that kind of trauma that so shatters your sense of goodness and security in the world. I had Harold Kushner, the great rabbi who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, in my synagogue for a public conversation a few weeks before. And I knew his answer. His answer was that in regard to his son Aaron, who had a genetic defect that made him age very quickly, progeria. And he said of himself, he said, when my son was suffering and dying, I needed God to care. I needed to be able to pray to God. And at the same time, I couldn't pray to a God who would do something cruel to an innocent child. I couldn't pray to that kind of father figure. And the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, is his analysis of the book of Job. And he says in his take on the book of Job, where at the end God says to this suffering righteous man, where were you when I created the world? He said that, as he understands it, is God saying, I created a good world, but the world goes according to its order, and genetic defects happen. Undiagnosed illness happens. So he said you have three choices: all-powerful, all-caring, all-knowing, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. And he said you only get two of the three. And he chose to have a God who was not all-powerful. Now that has a long history in the Jewish mystical tradition. In the Jewish mystical tradition, in the absolute sense, God is all. And yet God can choose not to intervene also. There's a story in the Talmud, it's Avodah Zarah, the tractate that deals with idolatry. Already over 2,000 years ago, the rabbi said, if somebody steals a seed, if a thief steals a seed and plants it, why does it grow? And to up the ante, in that same conversation, I think it's 54 bet, Avodah Zarah, the rabbis say, if a man rapes a woman, why does she get pregnant? There too, if God is intervening in terms of some of those biblical images where God is actively engaged in creation, well, why does God allow that seed to grow or that woman to become pregnant? And there they answer, Olam kaminago noheg. The world operates according to its order. Well, that's an intellectual response. So I went to that funeral. It was maybe it was February. I just remember it was cold and the earth was frozen. My friend and teacher, Rabbi Wes Gardenswartz, who was conducting, said, you will never experience such chill that you'll feel in your bones as this burial that we'll be sharing for a child. Soon after, I had a relationship with Elie Wiesel, who I look to as maybe my most influential teacher, other than my mother and father. And I went to see him in New York, and I said to him that I was still struggling with faith, still struggling with the sense of that tragic loss. And what did he think of Harold Kushner's response? First thing that he said that surprised me is he said he had never met Harold Kushner, which surprised me because Harold Kushner, of course, is so well known. But he said he had read his book, but he didn't agree. He said that for him, God is a question mark. He would say, because God is a question mark, if somebody says that God willed the Holocaust, that's blasphemy. How dare you claim that you know what God willed? God's a question mark. He would write that he could no longer worship, pray to the God of his childhood in the Hasidic town of Sighet, where God was Tata, Father, who you look to for comfort and support. And yet, he said, I can't fully explain God, because God is other. Well, on that journey, I went to see one other important teacher for me, and that was Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was kind of a neo-Hasidic rabbi. And I'd already had these conversations, and I shared these conversations with him, and I said, I'm still struggling with this tragic loss in my family. How do you deal with tragedy? And he said, I deal with it on 4 levels, what the Jewish mystics refer to as the 4 worlds, Asiyah, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilut. Physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual. He said, when I hear of a tragedy, the first thing I do is I ask questions about what happened. Tell me about the accident. Tell me about the illness. I take it on the physical level. On the next plane, I'm just present. I just try to hold them in their grief. On the intellectual level, he said, I can't go any further than Rabbi Harold Kushner, who interestingly chose to name his book not why bad things happen, but when bad things happen, because he says, I can't answer the question why. I can only tell myself and others what to do when it happens. And when it happens, I have a need to pray. When it happens, I have a need to have a God who I feel cries with me, who cares for me, which are also images, both in the Bible and in our rabbinic literature, that empathic God. But he said, intellectually, I can't explain more than Olam Kaminago Noheg. The world operates according to its order. Rabbi Feinstein and I had the privilege to have a common teacher, Rabbi Simon Greenberg, who pointed out, and it held for me, that the Bible never says that the world is perfect. It only says it's good. And good can be incomplete. And the greatest religious challenge is in the midst of any day, looking at the world despite its brokenness, despite its pain, and saying it is good. And so Reb Zalman said, on the physical level, I want to understand. Emotional, I want to be present. On the intellectual level, I can only say bad things happen to good people. But he said in Jewish mysticism, there's a 4th level called Atzilut. On that level, there's a sense of unity and purpose in the world. And he said, I can only glimpse that quality of wholeness. You can't grab it. But he said, I can get glimpses at times in the aftermath of tragedy that allow me to say it's beyond my understanding, and yet I accept it because God is a question mark, and more, because I, on some intuitive level, believe there's goodness in the world and that God, on some level, has a plan. I actually went back to Rabbi Harold Kushner, and I shared with him at another subsequent meeting my conversations. And he said to me, he said, you know, when Aaron passed, I couldn't see that 4th dimension. But now I would acknowledge that there is this other quality of unity, of spiritual mystery. And so, in reference to that difficult question, in some, there is no answer. For me, there is, on the intellectual level, a sense that we live in a good world that has good rules that usually work, and yet all of us, now to quote my most quoted teacher, my mother, we're all here for a visit. And that means each of us is going to die at some point from some way that our bodies fail us. That's part of life. And we can choose, instead of seeing that as the tragedy, and it can be experienced as a tragedy, all the more as a teenager, losing people that you love and need. But as one grows, it's always my prayer that the mourning process can be a time in which absence is transformed into presence, that the darkness can become a receptacle for light of the love and strength of the people we've known, and that what we can do is celebrate the fact that we live in a good world where people tend more often than not to heal. That when you go to the hospital, overwhelmingly, you come out of the hospital. Not always, but the body remarkably does heal. And so that's a bit of theology. Theology that ultimately leads me toward a quality of humility to say, God is other, and I can't explain God. And to that teenager, that's probably more than enough and even too much to say. What a teenager needs who loses in a moment of loss is simply honoring the pain of loss and acknowledging that life is incomplete. And yet, that, by the way, was Elie Wiesel's favorite expression, and yet, which is to always say there's another perspective in any moment. And yet, we do live in a good world. Now, when we come to synagogue, we're talking to God. So that's why I'm so pleased that this is your focus for your sessions. Because what we do as Jews, whether it's the Friday night table where you're lighting candles, and you're, in terms of the blessing, you're talking to God. That's true in holding up that Kiddush cup. You're talking to God and thanking God for Shabbat. And you come and you sit in services and they give you a prayer book, and it's a script of conversations with God. And so when we often come to synagogue, that can feel kind of inaccessible. What does it mean to talk to God? Who is God if God is other? So there's this whole other aspect of God in my life, and that's how Rabbi Feinstein ultimately framed it, which is for me as well as for each of you to ask on the personal level, how does your faith in God matter? And so I have an exercise that you have a piece of paper for that I want to do and talk a little bit about. And this is now the shift from talking about God to talking to God. So if you didn't get, you should get 2 sheets ideally. And Alana's passing those out. Okay, and you may need a pen. So I'll give it context, this experience that we'll then talk about. Many of you, how many here have been to the Kotel in Jerusalem, the Western Wall? And when you were there, how many of you wrote a note to God? So that's the custom. Let me tell you a little bit about that custom of writing a letter to God at the Western Wall. It's a custom of about 250 years. So Amos Oz claimed in his research. There was a rabbi named Moshe Attar who in the Hasidic world, he was from Morocco and he would move to Israel where he would live out his life. But he wrote a Torah commentary that was very influential in the Hasidic community of 18th, 19th century Europe. And he wrote in that writing that where there's a lot of prayer, a lot of energy focused on God, there's a greater receptivity to prayer. That's part 1, Moshe Attar. In Eastern Europe, people who wanted a bracha, who wanted a blessing for the health of a loved one, would go to the shamus, the aide of the Rabbi, the Hasidic master, and they'd write him a note, and they'd give him a note. They did this, by the way, also in the Russian Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe, where if you want a blessing, you would write it and you'd give it, and the priest would recite it for you. But back to the Jewish story. So Hasidim started going to Israel the end of the 1800s into the 1900s. And as they got there, they would write a note, because they were used to writing a note to their Rebbe for a bracha to give to the shamus. And based on Moshe Attar's statement that here at the Kotel, where so many prayers are gathered, there's greater receptivity, they turned the Kotel into God's mailbox. I remember the first time I went, my mother, who used to talk to God literally, she came from a Hasidic family in the Carpathia, and as she would drive to work, she would tell me later she would talk to God. And so when I went to Israel as a 16-year-old, she wrote a note, and she said, take this and put it in the Kotel. And I thought, oh, my mom does strange things. That's my mom's thing. It's my first time to Israel. As I got there, I couldn't find a space to put it. There were so many notes wadded up. And that was the first time for me that I then wrote my own note to God, a letter, not long. So I'm going to invite us just to take 2 minutes, a 2-minute note to God. And here's what I want you to do. Write as if God is listening and is the recipient. It's private. It's just for yourself, between you and God. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what that experience is like to write a letter to God. So take 2 minutes, dear God, and everybody have their notes? All right, go ahead, begin. Dear God. One more minute. Okay, if you can just pull that together. 2 minutes is not long. Here's what I'd want to share together. In writing, not the content of what you wrote, but the process. How is writing to God as an experience distinctive? How, in writing what you just wrote, again, not necessarily the content, that's private, what's distinctive, what's different about speaking to God? Anybody have something to share? Jan, Chana Liora. Okay, 1 second, Jan. 1 second. Chana Liora.
Yes, it works, I think. All right. I think it's a revelation that I know all along about what it is I'm going to speak to God, but it's not until I actually speak to God that it comes to fruition, and it becomes more intense and more holy and more important.
So I'm going to reframe it, Chana, and you can correct me if I misstate it. What Chana says, even though I kind of anticipate what I'm going to say when I write God, in writing God, there's an element of surprise. And what emerges is often more intense, and in that sense feels almost holy in connecting with God. And that's different than talking to a friend by the quality of surprise and intensity. Yes, tell me your name?
My name is Mitch Grease.
Mitch Grease. Did you grow up in Phoenix, Mitch?
I did.
Okay, we'll talk later. I remember you, Mitch.
Uh-oh. I better leave. I believe now in my evolvement and deconstruction of God from being a cloud that talked to Charlton Heston, I believe God is in each of us. So when I write my letter to God, I think I'm writing my letter also to myself, to the better part of myself.
So Mitch emphasizes that when he writes to God, it's as if that aspect of his own goodness, his higher self, is what's being tapped. Because if you're talking to God, you got to be your best from within yourself. What else is distinctive about a letter to God than even a letter to a friend? Yes? So there's this experience, even though you can't see God, or God's not speaking directly to you, there's the sense that when you write a letter to God, when you don't judge it, but you just go with it, that there is a caring receiver, a caring presence. Let me just add a couple more things. When we're talking to a friend or even a therapist who are paying to hear our material, we're always watching for a response to be validated. Even when we're saying our negative material, we want that therapist to be saying, but I know you're really a good person. I really like you. And that's true for friends. We're always monitoring when we're talking with a friend, how are they responding, taking in, particularly if it's something sensitive. But when we write to God, there's a sense of it being unfiltered. God's not going to tell anybody. God knows us. And that allows for a quality of honesty that also enables discovery. What emerges comes from a very deep place, be it our higher self or a deeper part of us that's often guarded. And so one is that there's this quality of trust in speaking to God, and with that, self-discovery. And more, what I have found in writing letters to God, I use this, by the way, in counseling. When people come to me for counseling, years ago, first time I ever used it for counseling, a woman came to me and she said, I was accused of embezzling my PTA. I was the treasurer, but I didn't. I was just a bad bookkeeper. So and she came to me like I didn't know, if she did or didn't. So I said, well, go into the synagogue and write a letter to God. And that's a segue, and I'll tell you what happened there. The segue to part 2, this is a bit of a stretch. And that is, for 2 minutes, write back to yourself as if it was God answering you. So, dear, write your name if you're willing. If you prefer to write to God again instead of answering from God's perspective, that's okay. But if God is a relationship, that calls on us for empathy, to imagine God's point of view, acknowledging that God is other. And I don't know, by a show of hands, has anybody ever done this exercise before? All right, I'm pleased about that. So, again, stream of consciousness. It's private. It's yours. Dear, write your name as if God is answering you. 2 minutes. Same paper or on the back? One more minute. Just 15 more seconds to pull it together. Okay. So this experience, so first time for you, what, if anything, surprised you? Again, not about content, because that can feel private, but in terms of the experience of what came through you. What was distinctive about the quality of the answer? Okay. I have somebody behind you. 1 second. Because you've already spoken, Chana, so what's your name?
My name is Farzan. And the action I was requesting, in a way, it came back to me as something that I need to do.
So, tell me again your first name? Farzan. Farzan said that what she had requested in her letter, and the answer back came to her to say, it's on you to do it. And I will add that in these experiences, and I've done this for many years in many settings, rarely is the answer a yes or a no, and rarely, and invariably, it's a reminder of our potential to do what is best for us to do. Other qualities are elements of surprise in the answers back.
I found that my name is Myrna. I found that as I wrote the answer was already in me, that I have the answers. I just have to get in touch with them, and whatever is inside of me wasn't something surprising. It was just important.
What's your first name? Verna? Myrna. So Myrna says that the experience of the letter back was a reminder, as an experience, that wisdom is within us when we tap deep enough. And that's also part of the experience of prayer, is not only speaking to God, but listening to what Mitch called the higher self, or as Myrna puts it, the wisdom that's within us to emerge. And sometimes that can feel, that wisdom, as being more than just us. If you will, I experience it as both the broadest perspective and the deepest values, as the space from which that wisdom emerges. Not that it's necessarily supernatural, but it's a different way of experiencing perspective, broad and deep, than I normally do. So we had one more here, and then I'll pull this together because I keep one eye, and I'm so looking forward to my conversation with Rabbi Feinstein.
Mine was similar to the first person who spoke, but one of the things I realized is that when I'm talking to God, I'm always asking for something. Please let this happen. Please let that happen. And my husband always says, you don't ask for something. You discuss or you talk, but you tend to ask. But when I answered it, I realized my husband had a point. I was then saying what I could do rather than asking God.
Are you going to go home and tell him he was right?
Yes.
Okay.
And he'll say I'm always right.
So tell me again your first name. So Sonia says that there's a sense of wisdom within us that we can find within ourselves answers when we're listening to that deep, still, small voice. You know that image in the Bible of Elijah who seeks God, and there's this dramatic sound and light show, and then all of a sudden, stillness. And he experiences God in kol dama daka, the thin stillness of voice. And so, to sum up this, and there's more that we could do, but time is limited, and that is prayer is speaking to God. All the prayers in our prayer book, if you now look at them as letters to God, a question to ask is, what was the prompt? Whether it was the sun rising or the sun going down or the preparation to read Torah. What's the prompt that you want to write a letter to God? And those words then can begin to feel more purposeful, more personal. Because all of us, I have found, have a need to say thank you. When something good happens in our life, there's a sense of the big thank you of, by the grace of God go I. Undeservedly, I was blessed for all the good in my life. A bracha, all those baruchs in our prayer book are prompts for us to pause and appreciate the goodness. Back to Rabbi Simon Greenberg, the great religious challenge is to cultivate gratitude and thereby experience the world as good. But prayer, and even in synagogue, is listening to that deepest part within ourselves. And again, I'm not saying it's necessarily supernatural, though perhaps when Rabbi Feinstein and I talk, we'll talk a little bit about the afterlife and how supernatural does inform my view. I'll foreshadow that there is a quality of mystery and connectedness in the world that transcends me. Mystery and connectedness is spirituality. Mystery and connectedness is God. And we connect with God by expressing what we need and want. But also, when I write my letters to God, I invariably find myself also sharing words of thank you, because I don't want to feel like an ingrate. And it's God who created the world. In that regard, and then I'll pull this together. When we talk about God having these experiences of prayer, and not just prayer, these are formalized prayer where we put our experience or our longings into words. But we can have holy moments, moments where we feel our breath is taken away by beauty around us, by kindness, by goodness, even by pain. When we feel our creatureliness and that we're here for only a visit, we can feel part of something larger than us, and that can feel like a profoundly holy moment of awareness. And so our prayers are there to educate us, to see the world as a resource of God's creation. Metaphors, for me, the key metaphor which links with ethics is God is the creator of the world, God is a parent. And as God is the parent, all peoples are created in the image of God. That's maybe the most profound teaching in our Torah, unique, I'm told, in the ancient world, a revolutionary concept that all people are created in the image of God, which means on the ultimate level that all people are infinitely valuable and equal and to be honored with dignity. And so God is the parent, and I am the parent of three. Nothing gives me greater joy than my children loving each other. And when they were younger, or even now, nothing gives me greater discomfort when they hurt each other, be it intentionally or unintentionally. And so all, for me, of religious ethics is the challenge to see the world through God's eyes, to see creation and people through the eyes of a caring parent to whom we are accountable, and more, to whom we are the agents of love and goodness in the world. And so I think it's now after 8. We'll have that stretch break. Let me again just sum up what I hoped that I shared with you. What I shared is that theology has a place, like in a relationship. You can love somebody, but there's never, we're all a mystery, and it's never always so smooth. There is value in stepping back and understanding who is this other person? What are the expectations that are reasonable? So as to have a relationship where happiness is expectations met. And so theology is important to clarify expectations. I am very on guard about wishful thinking, false expectations, because they can ultimately lead to a sense of despair, of having been conned by a belief. And so the intellectual analytic part, theology, is important. It's part of our Jewish tradition. And yet, the experience of God is the letting go of the analytic, to only return to the analytic to make sure that it's real. But what is real for me is that when I address God, whether as a letter or reading a prayer that I have the patience to identify with, or those moments of surprise in life, is the sense that there is a sense of mystery and connectedness in the world that I'm part of, and that's a wow. And that's the other 3-letter word for God, is wow. And where God is often too densely packed with all kinds of theologies, holy moments are part of my life and what I seek to cultivate to lead a life of greater significance and meaning. And so balancing theology and the openness to religious-holy moments is the quest for experiencing and honoring God. So after our stretch break, we'll return in conversation to more of some of the questions and further questions.
Thank you, Rabbi Spitz. You now have a chance to have an experience of a holy brownie, right? So you'll eat these brownies and you'll go, oh my God, see? That's how it works. So everybody stand up, go get a coffee, get a brownie, use the restroom, take a stretch, say hello to the rabbi, and in about 5-10 minutes, we'll continue with a conversation with Rabbi Spitz. Thank you all.
I'll give you a call.
Should I come in and take you for 20 seconds tomorrow?
Yeah. You want to do that?
Yeah. What? Give me,
tomorrow?
When you want me? 20 seconds.
What's good for you? Anytime?
Anytime.
Yeah.
Anytime after, let's see, 10:30.
Okay. Let's take a look. Okay, Ellie, we got to move this podium, guys. So let Rigo move the podium. 10:30 would be okay. Is that okay?
Yes, it's perfect.
10:45, whatever's easy for you.
It'll be.
I have a kid coming in at 11.
I will be. Yeah, this is 30 seconds.
I thought, yeah.
So, 10:30.
All right, bring your phone, yeah? And I'll say something wise. Okay. Great. How you doing? Okay? You guys well? Really?
A camper of mine who I've been close with for 40 years, it was his daughter. Mexican. He's Mexican. His wife. Like this. So I said, Rudy, how many people are coming from LA for this wedding? 300.
Jeez.
When we were on the plane, the whole plane was...
Wedding.
Yeah.
Wow.
I've never seen anything.
That's beautiful. How many people were at the wedding?
400.
Oh, my God.
Steve Leader.
Steven did it?
Yeah.
That's so nice.
Yeah,
Flew him to Mexico City to do a wedding.
we flew in Thursday, back Monday.
Yeah. Sweet.
So was everybody else. And just walking and see people there that you didn't know were invited, you know. How do you know them? How do you know them? Like Michael Weiner and Sherry Weiner.
They were there? Yeah.
Yeah. Who else from here? They go a lot from Wilshire.
Wonderful. That's beautiful. Whew. That's wonderful. Sweet.
It just goes on.
Yeah.
Wedding Saturday at 8:30. Finishes about 9:30. Then this was at the hotel. Then they put us on buses. They gave us tours the day before, and then they take us to wherever the party was. They didn't serve the entree till about 12:30.
Wow.
And then they had orchestra and entertainment. But all I know is they were serving breakfast at 6:30.
Yeah.
I wasn't there.
A New York wedding. Yeah.
I was the bride's grandmother. I said to Sherry, when she leaves,
We're leaving.
After her. She made it to 2:30.
I've done, when I was younger, we had a friend who got married in New York, and it was that kind of a late summer wedding. Starts at 9-something. They serve 2 hours of hors d'oeuvres. The wedding starts at 11. They serve you your steak at about 2 o'clock in the morning. About 3:30 in the morning, it's the Viennese table.
Yeah.
And about 5 o'clock in the morning, they're serving breakfast. Yeah.
I took pictures of it. It was probably from the piano to here.
Yeah, right, exactly. Unbelievable. And people are stopping. I mean, it's unbelievable. Because even though they've been eating, like it looked like they hadn't eaten in a week.
Drinking, they had this tequila bar.
Oh, my God.
And they were taking the nitrogen like this, so the smoke coming out of it.
Oh, really? Oh, God. Yeah. Have a little money, huh? These people,
Yeah.
מי שנכנס אדר מרוויח. Beautiful weddings.
By doing it in Mexico,
Simchas, you know?
they probably 60, 70% less money.
Yeah, but listen, it's simcha. That's these moments of your life that you say, you know,
Oh, yeah.
they're worth every minute, every penny.
The bride has a Rett syndrome system. I don't know if you've heard of what that is. It's like autism, but it's not, because your brain is fine. You can't talk. You can't clean yourself. You just have 24 hours. So she got, when everybody gave speeches the night before, she got up in front of everybody and had typed on her computer, and her computer gave her thing. It really was. Tears came. But she could even stand there in front of them. It sounded like a guy that just passed away. What's his name?
Hawking.
Hawking.
Oh. How about brownie? I am. Thank you. It's always welcome. Door's always open. Always welcome. That's so kind. Whole Purim spiel out of that music. So one year we did the Beatles, and one year we did 60s music, and one year we did Disney music, and one year. So this year we did this a couple years ago. We haven't like 10 years ago. We did Woodstock. Yeah. So it's now the 50th anniversary of Woodstock. So we're doing Woodstick. So he took all the songs that were sung at Woodstock, and he's rewriting them in Purim songs. You know. So it's. Seven.
How are you going to do country Joe and the fish?
Yeah, give me an F. Come on, all you big stone Jews. Uncle Mordecai has news. Got himself in a terrible jam. Way down yonder in old Shushan. So put down your books, pick up your gun. We're going to have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3. Where can I get a knife? Got a hankering for humming time. With Rabbi John. That's what we're doing. It's that kind of weird song. The best one we ever wrote, which we keep doing, is we do as an encore, is I can't get no Purim. I can't get no Purim Nashin. But I try and I try. Yeah, I know. It's amazing. Remember Woodstock? Phil was there. Phil went to Woodstock. Said it was god awful. Sure. Phil was great. Go right up close. Yeah. The latest one. It's one about this kid. The guy that raised it. That's
when you're ready, come and see him.
It's high enough. All right, let's do a little talking.
Ask him what happened to the woman that was accused.
Yeah,
told us.
She's in jail. No, we'll find out.
Where she told him to go write a letter.
Yeah, let's see what she said.
He said he was going to tell
Please come and join us. We'd like to continue our conversation with Rabbi Spitz. Come in and have a seat. Bring your coffee, bring your brownies. Hi. Thanks so much. How you feel? Are you okay? You feeling all right? Well, we'll do this for a while, and when you tell me you're tired, we'll stop. All right? You have a long drive home.
That's okay.
You going to be okay getting home?
I'm good. I'll be
sure?
fine, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I'm good. I have here. Thanks. I'm good.
It's a shul full of Jewish mothers.
It's nice.
You look skinny, eat, you know. How could you eat? Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Part 2, our conversation with Rabbi Spitz. Wonderful Torah this evening. And we have lots of questions to ask. The first question is going to be very strange. What happened to the lady who was accused of embezzlement?
So I'm glad you...
Is she in jail? Is it what happened?
So she went into the synagogue, and I told her, write a letter to God. She came back to my office. I said, okay, now go back into the synagogue and write as if God is answering your letter. She came back to my office, and she was elated. And she said, God said I didn't do it. So I don't care what other people have to say about me. God said I'm fine.
Yeah.
So what it was a reminder of, and I've used this as a counseling tool through the years, is that because when we're writing back from God or writing a letter to God, we're writing from our place of honesty and authenticity, it can feel quite significant. It can, in her case, you know, she felt validated. And she came to me, as people do come to rabbis, because she wanted me to validate her, but I had no way to do that. So that she was happy.
Wonderful. So what if you've asked us to do the exercise?
Yes.
What have you learned from doing this exercise with so many people? What do people discover when they write back the answers that God would give them? What have you discovered about people's discoveries?
So every time I do it, like even tonight, when I ask others to do it, I always do it also. So I did it now as well.
Yeah.
And a few things I've seen as a pattern. One, the letters back from God are usually much shorter than our letters to God. And,
no.
And I'm reminded, I had a teacher who was Walter Mond, one of these rabbi retreats at Camp Ramah, and he was Walter Mondale's campaign manager.
Wow.
And his key message for rabbis was, words dissipate power. His name was Hirsch. Words dissipate power. He said, you know, if you watch the Godfather, the Don says a word here or a word there. He said, rabbis, choose your words carefully, less words. So the first thing that I find consistent is that God's answers back is much shorter. He also defined power as the ability to affect change. Mm-hmm. So the ability to affect change in ourselves comes as a result of becoming, the second part, aware that there's a genuine wisdom within us or flowing through us that is not Ouija board yes or no, but a reminder to core values and core confidence. At the same time, I don't do this exercise that often, except when I'm teaching it more or less, or before high holidays, because I don't want it to feel too comfortable or too familiar with God answering. Mm-hmm. Because I'm always aware that it's an act of empathy and not prophecy. That the letters back are filtered through me, which may be true for all prophecy as well. But I don't want to get too familiar with it either for me.
You presented us with a very interesting sort of juxtaposition of religious experience and theology. And if I have this right, theology is cerebral. Theology functions as a filter to take out wishful thinking, destructive thoughts, to measure the value of our insights. Religious thinking is not cerebral. It comes from a different part of the self.
Yeah.
And you told us that that's the experience of the holy, an experience of the sacred. It can be an experience of God. It's a time when analysis is put away and we feel things, and we discover things in a very different way than we would sort of cognitively or cerebrally. That's an interesting opposition. So the question I want to ask you is, do they get in the way of each other? Does they, on the one hand, is religious experience so emotionally compelling that it lets through various kinds of ideas and thoughts which are wishful thinking or rationalizations or excuses or other kinds of destructive things, the ego speaking. And the other side, can analysis, cerebral filters become so powerful that they end religious experience? We become so self-conscious of our religious experience that we don't allow ourselves to have the experience. How do you balance the two?
So as you're sharing it, what came to mind was the nature of love. Now, again, I just celebrated my 32nd wedding anniversary last week, so
Mazel tov.
Different phases of relationship and the nature of love. But there is in love a certain quality of letting go of judgment, if one is wise. You have to almost consciously choose what to let go of.
Careful what you're saying. You're being filmed. I just wanted to, and your wife is watching at home. So.
No specific examples now.
Right.
So, and I think the same thing is true in terms of prayer. There is an element of wishful thinking, like in love. Mm-hmm. Wanting to see the best in the other and to feel that the other sees the best in us, knowing that it's not always so simple and it's complicated. And so for me, religious experience has those same dynamics and challenges. And theology, the intellectual part, back to therapy, informs my relationship. So to understand, in my case, how, for me, it was a revelation how men thought differently than women. In terms of men wanted a bottom line result more often, women wanted to express their feelings and feel validated before getting to an answer. So that one insight gave me an insight that it wasn't just my wife who wanted to keep talking when I had the answer, but that she had needs that were different than mine. And so, in that sense, the intellectual can inform the experience and how to get the most out of the experience, so that they're always kind of intermeshed and always incomplete on both sides.
But do you find that they get in the way of each other? Do you find, let's take the one, for example, that you become so intellectually self-conscious that you don't allow yourself to have the experience because you're watching yourself have the experience and asking yourself, am I doing it right?
Yeah. So that's the challenge of watching oneself.
Right.
You know, if you're dancing and watching your feet, you're not really dancing.
Right.
But in the beginning, you got to watch your feet to learn a new step.
Right.
And so there's a place for watching one's feet, and there's a place when you got to let it go. Mm-hmm. So, yes, the intellectual can stymie the experience because you're judging it, watching it, rather than experiencing it. I think that was Buber's comment to Jung. That was the main thing he was saying, is that at some point you got to let go of the analysis to have the experience. Mm-hmm. And the flip side is, if you don't have analysis to balance experience, you can go into dangerous places.
Right. The ego becomes deified.
Right. Either the ego gets deified or, again, wishful thinking. You know, a young person can fall in love with somebody who's not, on any analytic basis, going to meet their needs in life. But they're emotionally connected. So you got to have both.
So how do you maintain the balance? I'm trying to is there some kind of guidance, some wisdom about how one maintains this balance?
I think the only wisdom in maintaining the balance is to seek balance.
Yeah.
That one can't assume that the experience doesn't warrant some exploration intellectually, and one can't assume that life is all intellectual.
Okay. So you wrote a very, very challenging book, interesting book on the afterlife.
Yeah.
Which is a topic that Jews don't talk about very often.
Right.
We had a conversation with Rabbi Gelman many weeks ago in this series where he made a very strong case for teaching it. Your book is a fascinating exploration of the idea. So I'm interested in how you came to that, where your beliefs are now, and what was the response you got when the book was published?
So in the year 2000, I wrote this book called Does the Soul Survive? A Jewish Journey to Belief in Afterlife, Past Lives, and Living with Purpose. Just yesterday, I got a picture from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Our colleague, Rabbi Adrian Gottfried and his community just translated it into Portuguese.
Oh, did they really? Awesome.
So I was really delighted to see
Congratulations.
Rabino, you know.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. So in writing the book, what prompted me to write it is curiosity. I've always been very curious. In my 20s, I was exposed to psychics. I was going through a difficult point in my own life deciding what I wanted to do professionally, whether I wanted to be a lawyer, having become a lawyer. And somehow, out and about, I met my first psychic. This was a dangerous psychic. He wanted me to move in with him. And so that was one thing I learned. I learned that psychics can have power, and sometimes they can overreach, both in terms of their own ego needs, but also in terms of what their wisdom is. But he did have some uncanny insights. Years went by, and I was now a rabbi. And in rabbinical school, none of our teachers had ever said, I believe in the afterlife. I had learned in philosophy class what Maimonides believed about Olam Haba, the world to come, and how that was different than Nachmanides' perspective on the same term, Olam Haba. So intellectually, I had a full drawer of ideas, but as I went to people's beds and stood next to them and their families as they were dying, I was an agnostic about what happens in the afterlife. But I was curious. A congregant said to me that she had gone to a medium and gave me this tape. The only way she could go to, at the time, I think his name was John Edwards, the only way she could meet John Edwards was if she agreed to have it taped for English TV. And I knew this woman whose daughter had died at the age of 26 in a car accident. And she was very grounded, very mainstream. And she said, my test, I said this to my husband Zane as we were driving to LA to the studio, if she could say, if this medium, who wasn't Jewish, if he could say my mother's Yiddish name, that would get my attention. Mm. And so on a Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, my wife and I put in this is already 25 plus years ago, right? Our, what do they call it back then? VCR. We plugged it in. And I had never seen anything like this. It was pretty remarkable. So my curiosity was piqued, and I began to explore it. I spent a week with Brian Weiss.
Well, what was on the tape?
So what was on the tape was that John Edwards said to her at a certain point, your mother Ruthie is coming through, and described her and described their daughter. And I watched their reactions of the parents as this was taking place.
Right.
And she had given it to me. She had given me a book called Many Lives, Many Masters, the same woman book, by Brian Weiss, who's a psychiatrist who hypnotizes people to remember past lives. And she said, you got to read that other book. There's a world of mystery, Rabbi. And I said to her, but I don't know, Pearl, what to do with that. To me, it's Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with it. And she said, I'm not asking you, Rabbi, to do anything with it other than honor me in sharing it with you.
Okay.
And so stage by stage, and it did coincide with my mother, frankly, declining through strokes and at the end of her life. On an unconscious level, I wanted to understand more about what happens with the last breath. I'll share one thing that I don't think I've ever shared in writing. And that is, I was sitting at my mother's bedside when she was on life support, and we made a decision to turn off life support, that it was not, she didn't want to be on life support. She said and there was no hope at this point. I had my eyes closed and I was meditating, and all of a sudden I saw a light with my eyes closed. And it was at that point that my brother, who was a doctor watching the monitor, said, "Mom has just passed." But my eyes were closed when I just had this sense of light leaving. Bottom line, what I gained out of that exploration is that there's a mystery around death that I didn't focus on. For instance, I learned through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's the psychiatrist who wrote on death and dying, who I had the privilege to get to know. She said, ask people when they're dying if they've had any visitations from the other side, family members. And I started doing that with congregants. And not every time, but more often than I would have known. People who had been skeptics in their life, one physicist comes to mind, had that kind of experience before he passed. On the plane yesterday, I was reading a book that just came out in 2018 that I found at the Laguna Beach bookstore on mind and brain, which is a collection of academic papers, mostly Duke University, but edited by a guy from Berkeley, on these phenomena of near-death experiences, telepathy, the ability to guess how often a coin is going to be heads or tails. The research on it exists and is pretty remarkable. And so in sum, I've started this journey, it probably correlated with my mom's decline, and I don't live there, meaning I'm very analytic by nature. I'm not telepathic, though my wife probably is. And she has also normalized that people can have certain psychic gifts. And so how this relates to God, and that is, if you grow to believe, as I have, that there is this quality of consciousness that persists after the heart stops beating, that there's a quality of consciousness and even contact with consciousness on the other side, or if you will, that the brain and mind aren't the same, but that the brain is a receiver for mind. If you believe that, as I have, then there's this possibility of God as consciousness within creation. That there's a quality of presence within the world that is hard to access as our own consciousness, but is real. And that is a whole other dimension of faith in the divine.
So if you were to apply your other rubric to this one, and I'm interested in how and how the response to it was. So the other rubric is, one of the problems with that, the afterlife belief, is that it's just something we all want to believe so badly.
That's right.
And we're willing to cut all kinds of logical corners in order to get to a belief because it's so comforting.
Absolutely.
It removes the most scary thing about being a human being.
That's right.
So how do you make sure that you're not succumbing to that?
So it's a very wise question, and that is, how can one discern what's wishful thinking and not? Because clearly there is no greater wish to be fulfilled than the opportunity to continue to be in relationship with those we love after they've passed. And here too, the analogy I use is love. The fact that we want something to be true doesn't mean it's false. It just means we have to be aware that there's a lot of wish involved. So the fact that we all want to see ourselves as loved and lovable, which is core human need, doesn't mean we're not. But it does mean also to be with open eyes, not to be scammed by somebody who we would want to love us, who's really a con artist. And so back to the supernatural and the afterlife, I tend not to spend a lot of time there precisely because I can't carefully make those distinctions. The nature of the afterlife for me is a question mark. I can't really understand it or grasp it. I'm not telepathic. And olam kamina go noheg, the world operates according to its order. I live in the world on a daily basis with my rational mind, and I relate to God as the caring parent who created a good world but doesn't intervene overwhelmingly. And yet, there is a piece, maybe wishful, that says both that God is this quality of love within the world that transcends the physical, and that the afterlife is a quality of survival of consciousness that I have encountered. I tend not to believe it because I don't live there. So when I've had experiences with mediums, I have in that book, Does the Soul Survive? What's distinctive about Does the Soul Survive is it's written from the perspective of a juror, where I share different stories with the question, what would a modern person weigh as evidence? And modern people means we weigh the evidence ourselves. We look to our sages as fellow jurors, but not as the bottom line. And so, bottom line for me is why I read this book yesterday on the airplane, which I just came upon in this bookstore, is because I'm continuing to revisit it, to kind of say, was that wishful thinking on my part? Can somebody, because if a person can know things, take mediums. If a medium can know, which there's a lot of literature, a person goes to a medium. This is the classic story. And they go and they think they're going to want to commune with their deceased father. And instead, their brother comes through. But they thought their brother was alive. But in fact, their brother died in the intervening time and they didn't get notice. Or how many people here have had the experience of sensing somebody had died, waking you up in the middle of the night, and it occurring almost to that moment? It happened to my wife. Again, I keep relying on her. She's more open and intuitive than I am. And many other people. What's come out of the book for the 19 years is that people, when I'm doing a book signing, get in line to tell me their story. Yeah. And often, more often than not, I say to myself, well, that's wishful thinking. It was started to rain at the funeral just at the right moment, or there was a rainbow at the funeral. Right. And I kind of don't weigh that as being significant, that God's going to change for everybody the rainbow for that moment. That's an overreach for me. But there are patterns that I've grown to believe are real.
Okay. One last one. The last book you wrote was about depression.
The middle book.
The middle book. Is there another one after that?
There is.
What was the one after that? I missed one.
There's one after called Increasing Wholeness or Becoming Your
Oh, no, that
Best.
one I got. That's a different one.
But the book on depression is called Healing from Despair, and David has a copy here tonight. In my 20s, I was a mental patient, or as my wife used to remind me, I hope you're watching this, Linda, how often I quote you. She said, you wrote 2 books, one about why you believe in ghosts and the other about how you were a mental patient.
It's nice to have you here, Rabbi.
So in my 20s, I was a mental patient due to a neurologic problem, which was encephalitis. But it was more, encephalitis put my brain on tilt. That's a swelling of the lining of your brain where the chemical balance of your brain is thrown asunder. So I was delirious for a couple of weeks. And when I slowly recovered, I wound up in three mental hospitals in my late 20s being suicidal. And it was my great secret. As a rabbi, I went to visit a congregant in a psychiatric ward. And he was there for suicidal depression, and the door slammed locked behind me as I went in to visit him. It was the first time that I shared this. I said to this man, he's a bit older than me at the time, I said, I was once a patient here, not in this hospital, but several other hospitals for suicidal depression. And the fact that I could share that with him was meaningful to me, and I hope to him. And then I did it with others through the ensuing years. And then one year, I shared it to my congregation, having been there for 15 years. And the people were surprised because they knew me as their rabbi, as married with children and relatively stable, although my wife said, some people had said all along, now we know why.
That's their wishful thinking.
Right. So, but I wrote this book, and my goal in writing the book was to normalize depression. Because as I read the sources, in the Bible, you have Moses saying, God, if I have to continue, just take me. I can't go on anymore. Or women unable to have children, like Rebecca, saying, kill me.
Right.
Or Maimonides, who Heschel writes about not being able to get out of bed for 1 year after his brother drowned. Or in the Western culture, Churchill, who referred to depression as his black dog, his lifelong companion, or Lincoln, who suffered from suicidal depression in his 20s. And so I wanted to normalize depression and to give people hope. And since writing that book, what I've learned is to be much more humble. In that, my goal was good, but there are people who are biologically imbalanced in ways that they can't wish it away, they can't heal it away. And I've dealt with suicide since, where people were in such pain. I experienced that pain of being suicidal, just wanting to turn off the pain. But the humility is knowing that my experience, which was chemically induced by a specific illness, is very different than somebody who has a psychotic break or schizophrenic, for whom it's much more complicated. And I'm therefore both seek to provide comfort and to normalize darkness, but also humbly to support and acknowledge that every mental illness has its own contours.
I appreciated that book and the other one as well, the first one, the Afterlife book, because of the way that you personalize your theology.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's not something that's an academic exercise. It's always been for you, it's at least in the works that you write, and in what you teach in your community, it's a very personal journey. And it answers a very personal need, personal quest, which I thought was very, very, was very telling. It was very important for a rabbi to be able to do that.
Well, thank you. We have this colleague priest, Nguyen, who says of clergy that if we are to be healers, we have to be wounded healers. The name of one of his books, that only where we allow ourselves to be vulnerable can we be present.
Good. Let's take a few minutes. I know there's a few questions. Use this mic. Louise, let me switch microphones with you. Louise, let me switch mics, because this one works. Okay, there. Questions for the rabbi?
If not, we're going to send him all the way down to Orange County by himself. I know how to work it. That's why I know how to make nice to it.
I have a few questions. Let me just do this, but these will be like short 2-3 sentence answers that people asked at the beginning. Okay. So regarding gender, In monotheism, at
What
least.
was the question?
What does Judaism teach about the gender of God, as specifically the feminine in God? My teacher, Moshe Edel, who is the great scholar of Zohar and Kabbalah at Hebrew University, I once heard him say that of the monotheistic religions, the only one that describes God as having a feminine side is Judaism. You do find it in Hinduism. There are female gods. You find it in Catholicism with Mary being very important. But within Judaism, Shekhinah, God's feminine quality, is an essential part of the makeup of God. And the Zohar is really a romantic tale of the male dimension Tiferet looking to reunite with Shekhinah, the feminine dimension, as the key motif of Bible and God's operation within the world. And the wisdom there is that the male and female are complementary. And yet, which is not to say that, again, each person is unique, and how a woman or a man manifests his or her qualities is distinctive and not to be labeled. But at the same time, there are propensities that are different, and those are manifest in God. The question that Mark asked was about the biblical God and the modern God. The biblical God is walking through the Garden of Eden talking. There's a book by Richard Elliott Friedman, originally entitled The Disappearance of God. He's a Bible scholar who was at UCSD, then later at Georgia.
Right.
And he points out that in the beginning of Genesis, God is talking to the patriarchs and even the matriarchs. He never talks to Joseph. There's no conversation with Joseph. And at the same time, Joseph is constantly giving God credit. I can't interpret your dreams, he says to Pharaoh. It is God who does. But there's no conversation. So there's a shift in the Bible, and he points out that by the final book, the book of Esther, God's name doesn't even appear. And so there is this kind of a journey in the Bible of the immediacy of God to the God of the Talmud, who I once heard your rabbi teach the Tanur Achnai in Baltimore that I hold ever since with a much more profound understanding. The story of the rabbis who are debating whether this particular oven creates impurity or not. And ultimately the punchline of that story is Torah is not in heaven, even though Rabbi Eliezer, one of the rabbis, has a voice from heaven saying Rabbi Eliezer is right. The majority of the rabbis, with Rabbi Yehoshua on the other side, say, we are the ones now responsible for this law. And in that sense, God's role in our lives, in the biblical tradition, shifts a bit, and all the more in the rabbinic tradition. And Richard Elliott Friedman says, Christianity made the move to take God and embody God in a human. Jews made the move to say, we're responsible to interpret how we would imagine God would want us to act. And God can't intervene anymore.
God doesn't intervene.
Doesn't, right? Not can't, thank you.
Yeah.
Chooses not, does not intervene. Right. And so for a modern person, it's very hard for me to relate to the God who is the parent who's constantly meddling, caring, the hovering God, the helicopter God. I do believe that our relationship with God is matured, where God counts on us as that experience of those letters back to take responsibility and to live godly lives.
Do one more.
The last one is, what is God? And the one thing that came to my mind is in the Zohar, the word what is Shekhinah. Me is Bina.
Yeah.
And Ma is Shekhinah. So what is God? For the mystics, God is nothingness, ultimately, no thingness. Ein Sof. God is infinity. And infinity is something that a human mind can't grasp by its very nature. Because anytime you have a number, it's one more and one more, which is to say you can never grasp in any concrete way infinity. And the rabbis of the mystical tradition said ultimately God is without end, Ein Sof. But God chose to be manifest in the world in ways that mirror our own inner life, maybe in part because the only way we can understand God is through our own inner makeup, which is a God of relationship, a God of opposites, of kindness and restraint, enabling harmony, of ambition with recognizing the other, that allows for a quality of creativity, that allows for the feminine, of receptivity. And so the rabbis said, ultimately in the Jewish mystical tradition, that the only way we can understand how God is manifest is ultimately through how we're constructed, because we're micro, we who are created in the image of God. But ultimately, that's not God either. God ultimately is other, is a question mark, because God is without end.
Well, I want to thank Rabbi Spitz for being with us tonight. Thanks so much. And I want to congratulate all of you who have been coming all these weeks. You are hereby designated as graduates of the VBS College of Jewish Studies. You can move your tassel to the other side, right? We'll sing Pomp and Circumstance as you leave tonight. Wish everyone a very sweet night. We'll see you Shabbos. Take good care.
What's that?
Theological joke. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a bag in your office and it was locked.